morning. How are we? The faithful ones who stuck around. You are the ones who get to qualify for the $1 million prize that we give away during the last segment, so good for you. Because after all, we're saved by works, and you've stuck around, and you get the prize. I asked Dan why he asked me to close this thing out, and he said, I want to bury you at the back end, because in case you ruin things, we can minimize the damage. And I'll be honest, that was a smart move. Just a smart move on Dan's part. And I'm just thankful also that I can follow Dave Zoll, because that's not intimidating at all. Here's what doesn't make that intimidating, is my wife, who's at home watching the live stream, who's never seen Dave speak before at all. I said, you should check him out, he's really great, you should watch. And I was hoping that she would watch and be like, yeah, but I'm excited for you to speak because you're better. But that's not what happened. He happened to use every cultural reference that my wife loves. Like, she loves The Onion more than she loves me. She loves Better Call Saul more than she loves our children. And so she's texting me like, are you kidding me? This guy is amazing, my new favorite preacher of all time. So I'm leaving here really encouraged. So excited about this. Before I dive into what we're talking about this morning as we close things out, I want to just brag on my partner in ministry, Blake Flatley. I don't know if you know this, but Blake and I worked together in New York City. Blake led worship the last couple of evenings, and he did an incredible thing a couple of years ago when he left a very secure, better paying position at a larger church to come and hang out with us in New York City. And it's been a blessing to us to have him and his family do that. And part of the way in which he makes his ministry in New York City possible, because it's so cost prohibitive, is coming to stuff like this and selling CDs and shirts and all these things. He didn't ask me to do this. I'm doing this of my own volition. So I would like you to go to his booth after this and just give him a pay raise by buying as many shirts and as many CDs as you can, because that guy deserves it, and his music is really great. So thank you to him and Bill for leading us in worship. I'm thankful for both of you guys. So the technical topic for my talk this morning is joy, where to look when lost, and where to go when it's gone. And I'm going to give you the punchline right at the outset. I'm going to tell you something that you already know, and in relatively short order. I'm going to tell you something that you already know, and it's not going to take too terribly long. But I'm going to tell you something that you already know in short order, because it's something that we quickly forget and need to be reminded of often. And the answer is Jesus. Growing up, my dad used to restore cars to make extra money. These weren't show cars. They're not the kind you'd roll out on a Saturday morning while I drink coffee and eat donuts. These were side-of-the-road specials. We grew up in a rural part of Michigan, and my dad would see some car on the side of the road for sale at a surprisingly cheap price, and he would buy it. He would pour a couple $100s into it, put a fresh paint job on it, and he would sell it for a small profit. He did this over and over again. One day he brought home a pickup truck. It was 1985 Chevy S10 single cab with a racing stripe down the side, I don't know why, and a truly impressive amount of rust. And I remember being 15 years old and thinking to myself, this would be the perfect car for Matt Popovits. And so I immediately began to scheme and wonder, how could I get my dad not to sell this car, but to fix it up and keep this car? And so I began to build my case, and I remember climbing into the cab of this pickup truck and looking at the odometer and noticing that for a car that at the time was 10 years old, had a really low mileage on it. A point that I immediately shared with my dad, who then looked at me with a face that said, son, have I taught you nothing? And he proceeded to tell me something that he had, in fact, told me several times before. He said, Matt, when you're dealing with a beat-up truck sold at the side of the road, the last thing you trust are the gauges on the dashboard. if you want to know how this truck is doing, don't look there. And I remember thinking to myself, well, where the hell are you supposed to look? I mean, if you can't trust the gauges on the dashboard, where do you look? I never took up my dad's hobby. I studied acting, and then I went into ministry and focused on a different type of roadside repair. Yet I often find myself and the people that I love and the people that I serve wrestling with that question I was wrestling with when I was 15 years old. If you can't trust the gauges to know how things are doing, where do you look? You see, we all have like a dashboard of sorts in our life, a series of gauges that we use to measure our value, to measure our performance, to measure our standing with the divine, our esteem in front of others. And your dashboard can have different gauges than mine has. For you, it might be the success of your children, and then the trajectory of your career, the cleanliness of your home, a certain amount of money in your bank. And here's the thing, just like that old truck, sometimes life runs us so hard for so long that every gauge on your dashboard reads empty, or every gauge is somehow busted or broken or manipulated by your own hand or blown out completely. And you find yourself asking this question, where do I turn to see how I'm doing if I can't look at the gauges, if they're all telling me something I don't want to know? Where do I look to know how I'm doing? For example, what do I tell Gita? Gita is a 40-plus-year-old woman in my neighborhood near one of our parishes in New York City. I met her a couple of years ago when she kept dropping into our church events and into our church services, not to attend the event or take part in the service, but just long enough to pull me aside and remind me to pray for her son. She would do it over and over and over again. Pastor, please pray for my son, and then she would leave. 1 year prior to when I first met Gita, her 21-year-old son was stabbed in the stomach while he was out on a date with his girlfriend. And he was murdered in a random act of violence, and the killer remains at large to this day. And Gita was understandably craving justice, and she would say to me, Pastor, pray that the detectives find this man. And she's crushed under the weight of guilt, asking herself, maybe I could have been a better mother and somehow prevented this. Gita only has one gauge on her dashboard, and it's her children. That's it. She works shift after extra shift at LaGuardia Airport to make sure that she gives her children and her grandchildren the essentials that they need. She judges her success as a mother, her worth as a human being, the goodness of God, based on how her children are doing. So where is she supposed to look when the one gauge that she has is not just empty, but it bled to death on a sidewalk in Queens? What am I, as a pastor, supposed to say to her? Well, God works all things for the good of those who love Him. Pastor, am I not loving God enough because this doesn't feel like it's working out too well? Numbers chapter 21, deep in the Old Testament. The children of Israel, you may know the story, have been rescued from slavery, and at this particular point in the narrative, they are wandering. They've been wandering for some time. They've been eating manna for a good time now. They've been running short on water. They've been walking like crazy. And they're looking around at their setting and their scenario, and they begin to grumble. At least that's how we often put it. I think we should use stronger language. They're doing more than grumbling. They're pushing back on God and questioning His goodness. And they had one gauge on their dashboard as well to measure their happiness and to measure God's goodness. And the gauge on their dashboard read Egypt. And the big question was this: are we doing better today than when we were making bricks of straw for Pharaoh? That's it. And at this particular moment, and at other moments in the narrative, the answer was a resounding no. Life is hard. They're tired, they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they're sick of walking. And as a dad who earlier this week spent 2 days at Universal Studios with his 10-year-old daughter, I can tell you that it is dangerous to mess with a child who is hungry and thirsty and tired of walking. It doesn't matter how many times you've pulled them out of Egypt or paid to put them on Harry Potter. It's dangerous. Because you see, in their minds, this is self-righteousness, in their minds, they've done their part. Now God has to do his. I've done my part, and things should be getting better. And the gauge didn't read the way they wanted to. And so they started shaking their fist at God. And as you can imagine, God wasn't crazy about that. And so here's what happens. Numbers 21, verses 6 through 7. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many people of Israel died. Which, by the way, is a threat that rings hollow at Universal Studios, just saying. And the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he may take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about why God sent poisonous snakes to the children of Israel. The simple answer is this, because he's awesome. How awesome of a tough guy move is that? Lesser gods would never even try it. The point of the snakes, however, is this. The point of the snakes is judgment. And that's what the law, in some way, shape, or form, always brings, by the way. The law always brings, in some way, shape, or form, judgment, death. And the law, I know I'm kind of speaking to the choir here, the law, very simply put, are the demands, the have-tos, and the must-dos of life. Law is made up of the demands of God, be holy. Law is made up of the needs of neighbor, be kind. Law is made up of the strivings of self, be successful. And it's that law that drives me to the dashboard and calls me to gaze at the gauge and answer the question, how am I doing? How am I doing? And in a terribly broken world, with horrifically broken people, the answer to that question is always the same. You know what the answer to that question is? Not as good as you should be. And whenever we feel the panic of failure brought on by the pressure of the law and looking at the gauges of life, we are left with three choices and only three choices. We can hide from the pressure of the law, we can try to perform under the pressure of the law, or we can rebel under the pressure of the law, all of which eventually lead to some form of biting, stinging judgment against us. Hiding from the demands of life ultimately fills me with guilt. Trying to perform and meet all the demands of life will burn me out. I have some New Yorkers I'd like to introduce you to. Rebelling against the demands of life makes me a jerk. And so what do the Israelites decide to do? They go the jerk route. They decide to rebel against God by complaining against his goodness, and it literally bites them in the arm. I'm going to assume it was the arm. You've been there. You might be there right now. I was there last week. Maybe you're a church leader and your church is failing according to all the typical metrics, all the gauges on the dashboard, and you've convinced yourself that the problem is that you don't do enough, so you're just going to try and do more. Let me know how that works out for you. Or your marriage is a mess and it's marked with coldness and distance, and you've decided that it's no longer your problem, it's your husband's problem. So you're just going to hide out and make him worry about it because you're done. Or your kids have wandered from the faith, and you're thinking, damn it, I did my part. I drove those kids to church, I prayed with them before bed, and now you know what? I'm not going to church. I'm not going to church till God acts, till God does something. You know what Gita did? Gita worked, and she labored after her son was murdered. She didn't take on more hours at LaGuardia. She's maxed out there. No, she worked in here. And she worked in here. She racked her brains and she wrung her hands trying to figure out how she could have prevented her son's death, how she can find his killer, how she can redeem it all for good, and the pressure of it all is doing to her what the man who's yet to be identified did to her son. It's killing her. And that's what it always does. Matthew O'Reilly is an EMT worker in Suffolk County, Long Island, my part of the world. And in a fantastic TED Talk a couple of years ago, he shared how in his work as an EMT, he made a decision several years before this talk that whenever he was called to care for something who was facing imminent death, say a motorcycle accident on the side of the road, and when someone was about to die, and they asked him if they were about to die, which O'Reilly says they always ask you, am I going to die? That after years of lying to them or avoiding the question, he decided one day that he was going to tell them the truth. Yes. And then from that moment on, he's told everybody the truth. If they're going to die and they ask, he tells them yes. And what he's found, he said, is two amazing things happen. Number one, he said everyone immediately accepts the reality. He's seen very little panic, very little anger at the reality of death. They accept it. And then to a person, regardless of background, to a person, they follow up that acceptance by expressing regret, by confessing guilt. As they lay dying on the side of the road, they articulate a desire for forgiveness. He said, in his experience, all of them. Why is that? It's because we all feel the demand. We all spend our life looking at the dashboard, and in the final moments, we are forced to admit what we can no longer fight against or hide from, and there's no longer any time to try and perform. We can no longer hide from the fact that things are not, and we are not, as we should be. And so we confess. And that, to me, brings me back to the question at the very beginning. If that's where looking at the gauges of life always leads us, then where in the hell should we look? Back to Numbers 21. And the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten when he sees it shall live." So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. Again, this is such an awesomely strange moment. And there's a lot that could be said here. But here's what's happening. By ordering the serpent placed on the staff, God is giving his people a new place to look. He's giving them the opportunity, a chance to place their faith in something other than their circumstances, specifically to place their trust in his words. Look at this and live. And by placing that serpent on a pole, forcing them to lift their eyes off of their lives, their hearts and their hands, it's as if God is saying, looking at yourself and your setting as a measure for my goodness is what drives you to despair and presses you deeper into the sting of human failure. Lift your eyes up off of your efforts, your setting, your money, your friends, your followers, and gaze instead on what I, your God, place before you, no matter how weird it is. Fast forward a few thousand years, you know where I'm going with this. You grew up in Sunday school with the flannel graphs. Jesus is preaching to a Jewish leader named Nicodemus. And he's trying to help Nicodemus grasp who he is and what he came to do and who he came to be. He's trying to help Nicodemus have an aha moment, and he quotes something that Nicodemus would understand. He quotes the Torah, the part that we call Numbers 21, and this is what Jesus says in John 3:14. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man, and I picture Jesus with a giant thumb pointing at himself, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Do you see what Jesus is doing here? I'm telling you something you already know. Jesus is setting himself up as the sight for sore eyes and weary souls. When you are crushed under the labor of law and every gauge says work harder, every gauge reads, you're a failure. When things you use to measure success in life are so broken that you can't tell whether you're lost or found, whether God is good or bad, when you've been bitten by the brutal judgment of life's demands, Jesus is saying, I've come to be the one that you look to. Lift your eyes off of that and place them on me. And when we look to Jesus, lifted up, what will we see? Jesus says, you are going to see me lifted on a cross, bleeding for your failures. You're going to see me crushed for every crime. You're going to see me struck to secure your salvation. He's saying to Nicodemus, the Father is about to lift something crazy in front of you, Nicodemus. Look at it. Look at it and live. And nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. We lift our eyes to Christ crucified. Nothing has changed. And you may say, Pastor, well, when do I look? Do I look before it gets bad so maybe it won't get bad? I think you need to come back to the conference next time. It's bad now. We look now, we look today, we look at this moment where nothing is as it should be. And here's the big crazy secret that nobody will tell you, but this conference is all about. Those are the only kind of moments that exist. We lift our eyes to Christ crucified as our marriage is falling apart. We lift our eyes to Christ crucified as our kids are rejecting the faith. We lift our eyes to Christ crucified, this crazy thing put before us as we stand in the mud, as we are covered in failure, and based on what we see him doing, we believe not that we can be saved from this mess, but in defiance, direct defiance of every measure and every metric of our progress, we confess that we are saved in the middle of the mess. To be a people saved by grace through faith alone apart from works is to believe that you are also saved despite your feeling today and your circumstance tomorrow. And any take on the Christian faith that encourages you to examine yourself, to assure yourself, will only drive you to despair with what you relentlessly find in yourself. And so we lift up our eyes to the bloody and crushed Christ in your place, on your behalf, to know that today, no matter what you feel, what you've done, or where you are, you belong to the Father and you are beloved for eternity. That's what we do. My daughter is here with me today. She's been with me all weekend, and we have this ritual at our house. It's just between the two of us that started when she was an infant. I don't know what the inspiration was for it, but it just started when she was a baby. And every night when she goes to bed, she summons me to come tuck her in, which I've never really known as a parent what tucking in means. There's no tucking that takes place. But what it's consisted of for us is I look at her and I say to her, I got a secret to tell you. And she pretends that she doesn't know what the secret is. And she says, wow, what's the secret? What's the secret? And I look at her and I say, you are a baptized child of God. And I make the sign of the cross on her forehead. And then she looks at me and she says, I got a secret to tell you. And I pretend not to know what it is. I'm like, wow, what's the secret? That's great. What's the secret? And she looks at me and she says, you're a baptized child of God. She makes the sign of the cross on my forehead. It's cheesy. It's a way for me to lift Christ before her eyes. That she is in his death and resurrection right now, just to lift Christ before her eyes. And here's the thing, I'm not doing that for her that evening. I'm doing that for her 15 years from now, when she's blown it and she doubts everything, the love of me, the love of her mom, the love of her God, but she can look back and she can say, I don't know anything, but I know this. I have a secret. I'm a baptized child of God. That's why we do that in our house. Now here's the thing. I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, did we show our faithfulness by sticking around all the way to the end of this conference just so that this guy can tell us that when life gets bad, we should look to Jesus? And here's my answer to that. No. Well, kind of. We're going to get theological for just a second here. I mean, if your understanding of Christ crucified for you is merely a historical event that happened 2,000 years ago where God saved the world, then yes. I guess all I have to offer you, if that's your understanding of Christ crucified for you, is something that happened in the past 2,000 years ago, all I have to offer you is an intellectual exercise. When life gets bad, think about that. Change the channel of your heart to Jesus. But have you considered that Christ crucified for you is more than a moment in human history? Are you open to the idea that Christ crucified for you to gaze on, to look at, and to live is an ongoing, tangible, personal thing that God is still doing to you? Let me explain. We often lose sight of the distinction between the objective and subjective work of God. The objective work of God, objective salvation, objective justification, is what God did through Jesus Christ crucified for the world in the past. And that's good. Subjective justification, subjective salvation is what God is doing through Christ crucified to us to you in the present. Objective justification is when God reconciled the world to himself in Christ Jesus, and the world is forgiven of its sins through Jesus Christ. And that's a very good thing. Subjective justification is when he connects people to that forgiveness that is theirs. Subjective justification is when he connected you personally, publicly, supernaturally to that reconciliation, to that forgiveness in your baptism. Subjective justification is when he says to you, through the pastor of your church or the comfort of a friend on account of Jesus Christ who was lifted up for you, who bled for you and died for you, I forgive you. Subjective justification is when you come to the table broken down by the demands of life, ready to hide, to rebel, near dead from the pressure of performing, and the pastor raises the bread and the wine in front of your eyes and does a really weird thing. He says, take and eat, Christ given for you right now. Subjective justification is when you limp into the body of believers barely holding on. Your faith is flailing. You don't know what you believe or what you should say. And the voices of the body of Christ proclaim to you and for you the creed, the objective truth of what took place in our world. He was crucified, dead, and was buried. He descended into hell, and the third day he rose again. They say it for you and to you. Subjective justification is when God confronts you with the cross over and over and over again in tangible, audible, physical ways. He assaults you with grace so that over and over again, you who have been crushed by the demands of life might be brought back to life through the actual and unrelenting love of God in Jesus Christ that is lifted before your actual eyes, not merely reflected upon in your heart. Where do you look when the gauges are no good? You look to Christ crucified, but not just in here. No, some of you, the biggest problem with your faith is that it's all in your head. And you can say, well, Matt, I could look at Christ crucified without a church, and I'm just going to call BS on that. This is where Christ insists on being found, so that he can be lifted up in front of actual eyes and he can give tangible gifts that you truly need. And as a side note, you can try to have church by yourself, but you're going to end up hating the preacher and the parishioners there too. Christ crucified for me is out here, outside of me, so that he can give to me what is needed by me. Christ crucified is waiting in the church to welcome you, in the meal waiting to feed you, in his word waiting to tell you the true story of how Christ's righteousness has been given to you. It's lifted up before you in your pastor whose one job is to put Jesus in front of your eyes and absolve you. Jesus is still being lifted up for you to look upon with real eyes. I live in New York City, and a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine reminded me of something really interesting and beautiful. We were talking about some of this stuff, and he shared with me an illustration that he'd been using, and so I stole it. On the east side of Rockefeller Plaza in New York City, there's a giant statue of Atlas. If you've been in New York City, walked on Fifth Avenue, you've probably seen it, taken a selfie in front of it. You're one of those people. Atlas, you might recall, is the Greek titan who was condemned by Zeus to uphold the sky, often depicted as carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And what's interesting is that the statue of Zeus sits at the base of 30 Rock, which is the symbol of success and status and influence, especially for New Yorkers. So you get the sense if you go stand underneath Atlas that he's not only carrying the weight of the world, but he's carrying all of the symbols of success and status in New York on his shoulders. What's fascinating to me is that if you stand directly behind Atlas, and I've done this, it's really interesting, you can see as his knee is buckling what he's facing. He's facing St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is interesting enough in itself. It's kind of poetic. But if you walk inside of St. Patrick's and you head to the back and you stand behind the altar, you find another statue that's directly in line of Atlas, but it's hidden behind the altar. It's a statue of Christ as a child. And the world that's on Atlas's shoulder is being held in one hand by Christ, and he's making a sign of peace with the other. And what's interesting is that you've got to stoop low in order to see him. If you stand too tall, you might walk right past him. You've got to be brought low to see him. And together, the two statues speak a powerful truth of just how life works and where hope comes from. You will be crushed under the demands of life, under the weight of your world. You will be brought low, but in our weakness, in our lowest point, we lift our eyes, and we don't have to lift them high because what we're looking at is low like us. What do we find? We lift our eyes and we see Christ, weak for us, holding the world that wears us down in his one hand and offering us peace in the other. We all have a dashboard of sorts in life, and it's got a series of gauges on it that we use to measure our value and our performance, our standing with the divine, and our esteem among other people. But if I could give you any piece of advice, it's something my dad once said to me. When you're dealing with a beat-up truck bought from the side of the road, the last thing you can trust are the gauges on the dashboard. If you want to know how it's doing, don't look there. Lift up your eyes and live.